The snow came in sideways off the Hudson that Tuesday morning, the kind of storm that turned Manhattan into a gray study in erasure. Daniel Mercer stood outside the iron gate of PS 87, watching his daughter button the top of her coat, with fingers too small for the task. He reached down and helped her without being asked. "I'll pick you up at 3, he said. Chloe looked up at him with his own eyes, pale blue. Slightly too serious for a child of 8. She had her mother's hair, though, dark and thick, escaping from both sides of a wool hat that had been through too many winters. "You said that yesterday," she said. "And the day before. I mean it this time." She gave him the look that 8-year-olds reserve for adults they love but don't entirely believe. Then she turned and walked through the gate without looking back, her way of saying she understood, that she didn't hold it against him, that she was more grown-up than he'd ever wanted her to be. He watched until she disappeared inside, then turned toward the subway entrance, his laptop bag cutting into his shoulder, his thermos already empty. He'd been awake since 2. He told himself it was because of the cough. Chloe's asthma always flared in cold weather, and he'd spent 40 minutes last night counting her breaths in the dark, the inhaler on the nightstand between them, like a small white sentinel. But that wasn't the only reason. The Orange Line to Midtown. 22 minutes if the trains ran clean. He stood in the rattling car with his phone in his pocket, not looking at it, watching the tunnel walls slide past in the window glass. He thought about the packet capture he'd been running since midnight. He thought about the log file he'd saved to a personal drive before leaving the office at 1 in the morning. He thought about the cluster of authentication requests from a Belgian IP range that nobody else seemed to think was worth discussing. Viridian Capital Systems occupied the 31st through 35th floors of a glass tower on 6th Avenue FinTech, mid-tier but growing, managing clearinghouse infrastructure for a handful of regional banks. The lobby had that particular brand of expensive restraint. White marble, low lighting, a reception desk staffed by a woman who greeted everyone by name except Daniel. He didn't blame her. He was its support, level 2. He wore the same gray fleece jacket 3 days a week. He fixed printers and reset passwords, and occasionally stayed very late, for reasons he never fully explained. He badged through the turnstile and took the elevator to 32, where his desk sat in the back corner of the open floor, behind a structural column that blocked the natural light. It was a location that suited him. He could see 2 of the system status monitors from where he sat, and he could work without being watched. Trevor Shields, who managed the IT support team, was already at his desk when Daniel arrived, a round-faced man in his early 40s, who believed that enthusiasm could substitute for precision. He looked up when Daniel sat down. "You look terrible," Trevor said. "Thank you. Seriously, you sleep?" "Some." Daniel opened his laptop, connected it to the docking station, and pulled up the log interface before his coat was fully off. The authentication anomaly was still there. Worse, actually, the request volume had tripled since 1 in the morning. There were now lateral movement signatures inside the internal subnet. Faint, but legible, if you knew what to read. He knew what to read. That was the problem. His resume, the one he had never shown anyone here, listed 8 years at a federal cybersecurity contractor. 2 of them as lead analyst on critical infrastructure hardening. He'd left after his wife Renata, who had been a pediatric nurse and who had laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, died in a car accident on the BQE during a rainstorm 2 Januaries ago. He'd taken the first job he could find that paid enough and demanded little enough that he could be a father. He was 37, and he looked 45, and he had not told a single person in this building who he used to be. He opened a terminal window and began to type. The woman who had built Viridian from a 3-person startup into a company that processed $2 billion in daily transactions was named Victoria Hale. She was 41. She had a law degree from Georgetown and an MBA from Wharton and a reputation for making decisions faster than most people finish their sentences. Her office occupied the corner of the 35th floor, with a view of Midtown that on clear days reached the East River. Today the windows showed nothing but white. Victoria arrived at 7:15, passed her assistant without speaking, and sat down to a briefing she'd had prepared overnight. Q. 4 projections, 2 pending acquisition targets, a regulatory comment letter due Friday. She read efficiently, marginalia sharp and economical. She did not think about the IT department on 32. She rarely did. At 9, her CFO knocked. Warren Fitch was 53, Harvard undergrad, silver-haired in a way that had always seemed slightly too convenient. He'd been with Viridian 4 years, recruited from a hedge fund in Greenwich, highly recommended, consistently competent. He sat down across from Victoria and placed a tablet on the desk between them with a practiced ease. November numbers look strong, he said. I've seen them. The third quarter variance in the clearing segment. Warren. She looked up. What do you actually need? He smiled. He had an excellent smile, calibrated, not overdone. Wanted to flag that we have some infrastructure vendors coming in Thursday. Might be worth looping in IT leadership for the meeting. Then lope them in. Of course. He picked up the tablet. One other thing. We're still fielding the Drayden acquisition conversation. The term sheet. Send it to legal. I'll look at it tonight. He nodded and left. Victoria watched the door close. She could not have said what bothered her about the interaction, because nothing specific had gone wrong. But in the 17 years she had run businesses, she'd learned to trust the small wrongness, the microsecond of a pause where there shouldn't be one. The smile deployed slightly too quickly. She filed the feeling under the category of things to return to, and went back to her briefing. She did not know that Warren Fitch had, 12 minutes earlier, sent an encrypted message from a burner device to an IP address registered in Warsaw. She did not know that on the 32nd floor, Daniel Mercer had already identified the response. By 10:30, Daniel had built a working model of the intrusion in his head. It was cleaner than it had any right to be, not the noisy smash and grab of a criminal syndicate, but the methodical patience of a team with specific targets and inside knowledge. They knew Viridian's network architecture. They were hunting the clearing hub, the component that sat between Viridian systems and the 6 regional banks in its clearing network. The recon phase alone, the careful, patient mapping of the network topology before a single exploit had been attempted, represented days of prior access. Possibly weeks. He submitted a formal incident report through the internal ticketing system at 10:47. He marked it Priority 1. He included 3 pages of technical documentation, packet captures, log excerpts, annotated traffic maps, and addressed it to Trevor Shields and to the Director of Technology Operations, a man named Glenn Okafor, who worked on the 34th floor, and who Daniel had met exactly twice. He described the threat in plain language, the kind that a non-technical manager could follow, because he had learned long ago that the failure point in most incident responses was not technical comprehension, but human communication, and he was trying, still, to operate within the system before operating around it. He waited. He refreshed the ticket queue at 11, at 11:10, at 11:12, at 11:15, Trevor appeared at his desk. Hey. So I looked at your ticket. Okay. Trevor lowered his voice, which was a bad sign. It meant he was about to manage something rather than solve it. Glenn flagged it as a potential false positive. He said the Belgian traffic is consistent with a new API partner we onboarded last month. Daniel turned in his chair. Trevor. The lateral movement signatures are inside the authentication boundary. A legitimate API partner doesn't have access to the internal subnet. Glenn thinks it might be a routing misconfiguration. It's not a routing misconfiguration. He pulled up the relevant log file and turned his monitor so Trevor could see it. The probe signatures were there in clean, repetitive rows, a machine testing boundaries, recording responses, building its own map. This is reconnaissance. Whoever is on the other end of this is building a picture of our interior network. They're not lost. They're studying us. Trevor looked at the screen with the expression of a man regarding a document in a foreign language, not contemptuous, but genuinely at sea. He had been in IT management for 20 years and had spent most of them on the administrative side, handling procurement and vendor relationships and performance reviews. He was not equipped for this, and he knew it, and knowing it made him cautious rather than curious. He's going to have someone look at it tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning is too late. Trevor looked at him with something between sympathy and the particular weariness of someone who has heard that phrase too many times from too many people. I hear you, but I need you to let Glenn's team handle it from here, okay? That's not your scope. He walked away. Daniel turned back to his monitors. On the secondary screen, The traffic map showed 17 new probes in the 12 minutes they'd been talking. He looked at the number for a moment, then made the only decision available to him. He wrote an email to Glenn Okafor directly, attaching the full documentation packet, marked urgent, and then he closed the email client and began to work on the assumption that no response was coming. He did not wait for Glenn Okafor's team. What he built over the next 90 minutes was not elegant. It was a series of patched interventions, script-based tripwires and traffic redirects, a temporary architecture assembled from the materials at hand, like a field surgeon making do with what the kit contained. The constraints were real. He had no administrative privileges over the network tier, which meant he was operating through application layer workarounds that were slower and less stable than what he'd have built with proper access. He created a honeypot node to absorb the lateral movement and feed the attackers stale data, routing their probes into a dead-end replica of the subnet, where they could map to their satisfaction and find nothing of use. He wrote a shell script that would auto-rotate the clearing hub's authentication tokens every 4 minutes, staying ahead of the brute force cycle they would run when the reconnaissance phase ended. He quarantined the 2 internal accounts that had shown anomalous access patterns in the previous 18 hours, flagged them for review under a service category that would not generate a visible alert, and replaced their access with proxy accounts that he could monitor in real time. He was aware that he was doing this without authorization. He was aware that if someone reviewed his session logs, he would have difficulty explaining the scope of his activity under his current role description. He was also aware that the clearing hub processed approximately $3 billion in transactions per week across 6 regional banks, and that the attackers were 14 hours into a staged intrusion, and that the ticket he'd filed at 10:47 was not going to be read before morning. He ate half a granola bar at his desk at noon. He did not register being hungry until he had finished it. At 2:50, he remembered Chloe. He looked at the time, then at the screen, then at the time again, the specific arithmetic of a parent who is also an engineer, trying to calculate margins simultaneously in 2 different systems. The honeypot was holding. The token rotation was running clean. The clearing hub was processing normally. He had 45 minutes of margin, maybe 60, if the attackers didn't escalate overnight, which he did not believe they wouldn't, but which was the only gamble available to him. He called the school's aftercare program. He apologized, not for the first time, to the coordinator, who answered with a patience that had clearly been worn smooth by encounters like this. He sent a text to his neighbor, Margaret Osei, a retired 4th-grade teacher, who had become something like a grandmother to Chloe. Through proximity and shared circumstance, she lived 2 doors down and had a key to the apartment, and had, over the course of 18 months, quietly absorbed a significant portion of the unpredictable gaps in Daniel's schedule, without ever asking to be thanked for it. Margaret said she'd get her. He felt the familiar arithmetic of owing people more than he could repay, and the accompanying decision not to let the feeling become paralysis. He stayed. The escalation came at 8:17 in the evening. The floor was nearly empty. A few junior analysts still at their desks, the ambient hum of the HVAC system, a security guard making slow rounds past the rows of dormant workstations. Most of Viridian's employees had gone home to the ordinary business of Tuesday evenings: dinner, television, whatever small private rituals people maintain to mark the boundary between work and the rest of a life. They did not know that the work was happening without them. Daniel saw the traffic spike the moment it started. A coordinated DDoS wave against the perimeter, beautifully orchestrated, designed to consume processing capacity, while a second, quieter thread exploited an edge in the token rotation gap. He had anticipated the DDoS. It was a standard accompaniment, noise to cover the real approach. But he had built the token rotation with a 4-minute cycle, specifically because the brute force pattern he'd observed in the reconnaissance data suggested a 5-minute attack cadence. He'd had a margin. What he had not fully anticipated was how precisely they knew where the margin was. They were not guessing at his defenses. They were working around a known map. Inside knowledge, the thought settled in him with the particular weight of confirmation rather than surprise. It removed an uncertainty that had been costing him processing overhead, and he let it go and moved on. He worked. That was the only word for it: not scrambling, not panicking, but working with the focused economy of someone who had been in rooms like this before, who understood that speed without precision produced nothing, and that the correct response to complexity was not speed, but sequence. He isolated the perimeter layer and let the DDoS exhaust itself against a degraded surface, deliberately limiting the resources he offered to consume, so that the attackers wasted capacity hitting nothing while he rerouted the clearing hub's processing to a backup segment he had quietly prepared at 6 in the evening and told no one about. The backup segment was slower by 12%. Under the circumstances, 12% slower was perfectly acceptable. He called the aftercare center at 8:30 to confirm Chloe had gotten home with Margaret. She had. They told him she'd left a drawing on the kitchen table for him. He said, "Thank you." He did not allow himself to think about the drawing for more than the 3 seconds it took to redirect his attention. At 9:15, he stood up to get water from the kitchen on the other side of the floor. He walked the length of the empty room in near darkness, past the rows of chairs that would fill in 11 hours with people who would never know what had happened in the building while they slept. He filled a paper cup, drank it, filled another. He stood there for a moment in the kitchen, in the dark, looking at nothing. He thought about Renata. He didn't do this often, had trained himself out of it, mostly because it was a current he couldn't afford to get into when he had other things to hold. But in the dark kitchens of late nights, he sometimes didn't have the resources to keep the door closed. She had been someone who believed, with an uncomplicated conviction that had at first seemed naive to him and later seemed like the most sophisticated thing he knew, that the right thing was always the specific right thing in front of you. Not the abstract principle. Not the systemic problem. The thing in your hands. He walked back to his desk. At 11:40, a second wave hit injection attempts against the database layer, concurrent with a social engineering call to the overnight help desk, attempting to extract a session token under the cover of a fabricated maintenance request. He saw the help desk ticket come through in real time. Flagged it through the ticketing system before the help desk operator had finished reading the caller's first request, and killed the access pathway at the network level simultaneously. The help desk operator would later say the call had ended abruptly, as if the caller had realized mid-sentence that something had changed. That was approximately correct. At 12:50, a third wave targeted the API endpoints, a more subtle approach, probing for parameter injection vulnerabilities in the external-facing layer. He had patched 3 of the 4 vulnerable parameters during the afternoon. He patched the 4th now, watching the probe traffic shift as it encountered the closed surface, adapting, probing again, and ultimately retreating. He stopped each one. Not cleanly, there was collateral, minor service degradation in 2 non-critical modules, 3 minutes of elevated latency on the clearing hub that resolved before any client monitoring system registered it as an outage. But the clearing hub processed. The transactions cleared. The 6 regional banks on the other end of Viridian's connections went about their business without interruption. At 3 in the morning, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The industrial gray acoustic tile. The recessed lighting that the motion sensors had half dimmed in response to the empty floor. His hands were shaking slightly, not fear. Just the lag of adrenaline against exhaustion, the body accounting for itself after the emergency had passed. He drank the cold remnants of a coffee he'd bought 7 hours ago and wrote a detailed incident log that he saved to his personal drive, to a cloud backup, and to the internal system under a ticket number that he suspected no one would read before morning, but which he wrote anyway because documentation was the last act of professionalism available to him, and he had always been, before anything else, professional. He should have left. He knew he should have left. The immediate crisis was contained, the scripts were running, the monitoring alerts were active. He had done what he could do. He did not leave because the data suggested a 4th wave was staged and waiting, and because he did not fully trust the scripts to adapt if the attackers changed their pattern, and because if he left and the clearing hub went down, 6 regional banks would wake up to failed transactions, and Viridian would wake up to a regulatory catastrophe, and he would have been the last person who could have prevented it. He had a specific understanding of his own position in the system. He did not dress it up or minimize it. He simply remained inside it. He put his head down on the desk. He thought he would rest for 20 minutes. The snow had stopped outside. The city was quiet in the way that only cities can be quiet, not silent, but running below itself, the ambient hum of infrastructure maintaining itself through the dark. He was asleep in 4 minutes. Victoria Hale did not plan to do a floor walk on Wednesday morning. Her calendar showed 2 calls before 9, a board prep session at 11, and a lunch she'd been rescheduling for 3 weeks. She came down to 32 because the elevator stopped there on a mechanical default, and she stepped out without thinking. The way you step into a current. The floor was coming alive in the way that open offices do, laptops opening, coffee cups distributed. The low murmur of people orienting to the day. She walked the perimeter, which she did perhaps once a month, looking at nothing in particular and registering everything. She saw him from 20 feet away, a man, gray fleece jacket, dark hair badly needing a cut, asleep at a desk in the back corner, head on his arms, face turned toward the window. His screen was still active, showing something she didn't recognize, columns of text and numbers running in a terminal window. An empty coffee cup. A half-eaten granola bar still in its wrapper. Something in her went cold and efficient. She had zero tolerance for this, not for reasons of cruelty, but because she ran a financial institution, and because she believed, with genuine conviction, that the standards you held were the standards you received. She turned to the nearest person, a young man whose name she thought was Patrick. "Who is that?" she said. Patrick looked. "That's Daniel Mercer. He's level 2 support." She walked to the desk. She stood there for a moment. The man didn't stir. She looked at the screen and saw that it meant nothing to her. In this context, she could read a balance sheet in 4 seconds, but a terminal window full of log output was another language. She touched the edge of the desk. "Excuse me." He woke the way people wake, who have been surviving on inadequate sleep, not gradually, but all at once, with a sharp inhale and eyes that were immediately, completely alert. He sat upright. Looked at her, looked at the screen, looked back at her. "Miss Hale." His voice was entirely level. "How long have you been here?" He thought about it, not evasively, genuinely doing the arithmetic. "Since yesterday morning." She looked at the terminal window, at the empty cup. She felt, very briefly, the current of something she couldn't name. And then she pushed it aside. "You understand I can't overlook this," she said. "I know. This is not the standard we hold here." He said nothing. "I'm going to need you to gather your things." He held her gaze for 1 second, not challenging, just looking, as if he were making a small note of something, and then he nodded. He reached for his bag. He began, quietly and methodically, to shut down his personal sessions. She watched him for a moment, and then looked away, because watching felt suddenly uncomfortable in a way she couldn't rationalize. She was almost to the elevator when she heard him. From across the floor, not loud but clear. "The system will last about 6 hours without someone watching it. Maybe less." She stopped, did not turn around. "There's a ticket in the system. Priority 1. You should probably have someone read it before 9. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped inside. She told herself it was deflection. A subordinate using technical mystification to reframe his own failure. She had seen it before. She pressed 35 and watched the floors pass. She did not read the ticket before 9. She was on a call. It started at 11. 3 client accounts flagged elevated latency on the clearing hub. Trevor Shields, who had been fielding help desk calls since 9, escalated to Glenn Okafor, who looked at the internal monitoring dashboard and saw nothing that indicated a systemic issue. He attributed the latency to network congestion and recommended a standard diagnostic cycle. By 11:40, the latency had spread to 11 accounts. Glenn escalated to the vendor support line. The vendor ran remote diagnostics and found, to their considerable confusion, a network architecture. They didn't recognize a series of redirect rules and custom scripts layered over the native system like scaffolding over a building under repair. They reported that they would need several hours to understand what they were looking at before they could make any changes. Glenn said to leave it alone until they understood it. At 12:30, the 4th wave arrived. It did not announce itself. It came in the form of a small, clean exploit against a specific database endpoint, the one that the scripts had been covering, the one that required active management to stay patched because the underlying vulnerability was in a legacy module that couldn't be updated without taking the entire segment offline. The scripts had been compensating. The scripts needed someone to tell them what to do when the attack vector changed slightly, which it had, by 12 degrees, at 12:31. No one was watching. By 1:15, the clearing hub was processing at 40% capacity. By 1:50, it had stopped. The trading floor on 33 registered the failure in the particular way that quantitative professionals register system failures, not with panic, but with a rapid, precise flurry of escalation calls. Victoria was in her board prep session when her phone lit up with 3 simultaneous texts from her COO. She excused herself. She stood in the hallway outside the conference room and listened while her COO, a calm man named Preston Walsh, not given to hyperbole, told her that the clearing system was down, that they had approximately 40 minutes before their first client SLA breach, that Glenn Okafor's team was on the floor but did not understand the system's current state, and that the vendor had declined to touch it without another 4 hours of assessment. She said, "Who built the system's current state?" Preston said, "We're trying to determine that." She said, "Check the ticket queue. Priority 1, filed yesterday." A pause. "I'll be right there." The ticket was 6 pages long, technically dense, time-stamped at 10:47 the previous morning. Glenn Okafor read it in his office, with the door closed and with the particular expression of someone who is mentally preparing to have their understanding of a situation revised entirely. The ticket documented, in precise and unremarkable language, a sustained intrusion attempt staged, technically sophisticated, demonstrably well-informed about Viridian's internal architecture. It documented Daniel Mercer's individual interventions over a period of approximately 14 hours, each one annotated with the timestamp, the method, and the anticipated attacker response. It described the honeypot, the token rotation, the backup clearing segment. It named, in a section labeled Simply Working Hypothesis, the probability of an internal information source. At the end of the ticket, in a section dated 3:17 a.m., a final entry read, "Fourth wave staging likely. Attack vector expected to shift to database endpoint if token rotation pattern is identified. Manual oversight required. Scripts will not adapt autonomously to a shifted vector. If someone is reading this later, start there." Glenn read that sentence twice. Then he walked out of his office. Across the floor, 2 of his junior engineers had already found the scripts were actually arguing about whether to disable them, because they didn't understand their purpose, and the principle of, if in doubt, remove it, had a powerful intuitive appeal. Glenn crossed the room faster than he'd moved in months, and told them to stop touching everything. "Find me Mercer," Victoria said from the doorway. She had come down from 35. Her face was composed in that particular way that meant she was working very hard to keep it that way. "He was terminated this morning," someone said. "I know that." Her voice didn't change. "Find him anyway." She went herself. She could have sent Preston, or HR, or a car service with a message. But she went herself. She told herself it was efficiency, she'd have to speak to him eventually, and there was no time for intermediaries. She did not examine the other reason closely enough to name it. The address in the personnel file was a pre-war building on 101st Street, between Amsterdam and Columbus. The elevator was out. She climbed 4 flights. The hallway smelled like cooking and old wood and the particular warmth of buildings that have been lived in for decades. She knocked on 4C. The door opened, and she was looking at a child, 8 years old maybe, dark hair in 2 lopsided braids, an inhaler in one hand and a library book in the other. She regarded Victoria with the complete, unself-conscious appraisal that children apply to strangers. "Is your father home?" Victoria said. The girl turned and called, without moving from the doorway. "Dad." "Someone's here." There was the sound of a chair, footsteps, and then Daniel was in the doorway, and she saw him in a way she had not had time to see him that morning. He was in jeans and a worn gray t-shirt. His eyes had the specific hollowness of someone operating past depletion, not the theatrical tiredness of a long meeting, but the anatomical kind, the kind that sits behind the face. He looked at her without surprise. "Miss Hale." He stepped back. "Come in." The apartment was small and scrupulously ordered in the way that small apartments become when they're inhabited by someone who understands that mess is a luxury. A kitchen table with 2 chairs, a living room with a couch that showed the slight permanent impression of someone sleeping on it regularly. On the table, a drawing in crayon, a man and a small girl standing in the snow outside a large building, both figures rendered with the particular ambition and imprecision of an 8-year-old doing her best. "Chloe," Daniel said, "can you go read in your room for a bit?" The girl went, taking the library book. She glanced at Victoria once on her way past, not hostile, just curious. The way curious children look at things that don't yet have a category. Victoria stood in the living room. She did not sit down. "The system is down," she said. "I know. We don't understand the architecture you built. I wrote it in the ticket." "I know you did." She paused. "Glenn's team is there. They've found the scripts. They're not sure what to touch." He said nothing. He was looking at the window, where the afternoon light was coming through at a low angle, gray and diffuse. The specific quality of winter light on the Upper West Side. She said it plainly, because she had learned, in 17 years, that plainness was almost always faster. "I'm asking you to come back." He turned then and looked at her, not with anger, which she'd been prepared for, not with the satisfaction of someone waiting to be asked. He looked at her with something more inconvenient, a simple, level consideration, the look of a man deciding whether a thing is worth doing. "The fourth wave came," he said. "Yes. Database endpoint. Shifted vector. The system went down at 150. He nodded slowly, as if confirming a calculation. "There's still an active attacker. Taking the system down doesn't end the intrusion. It just changes what they're doing. I understand that now. There's also an internal source." He said it quietly, without drama. "Whoever ran this operation knew too much. Routing tables. Segment architecture. Token schedules. You have someone on the inside who provided it." She held very still. "Do you know who?" "I have a working hypothesis." He looked at her. "I'll need access to the full authentication logs. 30 days. Not just the clearing segment." She said, "Whatever you need." There was a sound from the hallway, a small cough, quickly suppressed. He looked toward it, and something in his face changed in the barely perceptible way that parents' faces change when they locate a child in a room. "I need an hour," he said. "She needs her medication and dinner." Victoria looked at the doorway where the girl had gone. At the crayon drawing on the table. At the couch, with its faint impression. "Take 2, she said. He walked back into Viridian at 6:17 p.m., carrying his laptop bag and a thermos. He did not go through HR, did not sign anything, did not speak to anyone in the lobby, except to badge through on the access card that had not yet been deactivated. An oversight that someone would later describe as fortunate, and that Daniel had quietly anticipated. Glenn met him on 32. Glenn was a careful man, and there was something in his face that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a competent person confronting a problem that exceeds their competence and recognizing the recognition. "The scripts are still running," Glenn said. "We didn't touch them." "Good." Daniel sat down at his desk and plugged in. "I need the full authentication logs. 30 days, all segments. And I need someone to tell the vendor to stand down. They want to. Tell them to stand down." He looked at Glenn, and something in the quality of the look ended the conversation. Glenn took out his phone. Daniel looked at the system state. The clearing hub was offline. The attacker, having achieved what they'd staged for, had gone quiet, which was its own kind of signal. They weren't gone. They were repositioning. He had perhaps 4 hours before they found their footing in the new landscape. He began. The work was quieter than it had been in the small hours of Tuesday night, not because it was easier but because the crisis had resolved into a problem, and problems had structure. He brought the clearing hub back online in 43 minutes, not a full restoration, but a functional state with a new authentication architecture that the attacker's existing credentials would not penetrate. He wrote the logic in clean, documented code this time, annotated for the engineers who would maintain it after him. The authentication logs came through at 7:40. He spent 11 minutes reading them. The pattern was not complex, which was almost always how it worked. The sophisticated operations rarely relied on sophisticated access. They relied on one person with ordinary privileges, doing ordinary things that became, over time, a complete map of the territory. 30 days of access logs showed a specific account, a user-level account belonging to a vendor liaison, making regular queries to system architecture, documentation, routing configuration files, and network topology exports. The queries were spaced irregularly, mimicking normal usage. But the specific files requested, assembled in sequence, formed a complete operational briefing for the attack that had been executed against them. The vendor liaison account was a service account. It had been created 14 months ago, during a system integration project managed by the CFO's office. Daniel looked at the account creation record for a long moment. He looked at the timestamp. He looked at the approving authority field. He picked up his phone and called Glenn. "I need a room," he said. "I need Victoria Hale and your legal and security leads in it. And I need someone to make sure Warren Fitch is still in the building." The conference room on 34 had glass walls and a long table. Daniel had asked for something with no glass walls. Victoria had overridden him without explaining why, and then, halfway through the request, understood why he'd asked and told someone to bring screens for the windows. By 8:15, they had a room that was as private as a glass-walled building could be made. There were 7 people in it: Victoria, Glenn, Preston Walsh, the COO. The general counsel, a composed woman named Sandra Birch, the head of corporate security, a former FBI analyst named James Reeves, who had been called in from home, Warren Fitch, and Daniel. Daniel had printed nothing. He connected his laptop to the conference room display and walked them through the 30 days of access logs in 18 minutes. He spoke without jargon, not because he was simplifying for the room, but because the facts didn't require ornamentation. Here was the account. Here were the files accessed. Here was the sequence that mapped to the attack. Here was the account's creation record. He clicked to the final slide. The approving authority field showed 3 letters. WF. "That's a standard workflow abbreviation," Fitch said. He was good. Victoria noticed it. The way he didn't move, didn't shift. Came to his defense, almost before the accusation had fully assembled itself in the room. "Half the service accounts created in that period have my initials on the approval chain. It's an administrative artifact." "It is," Daniel agreed. By itself. He moved to the next screen. Email metadata, not content, just headers, timestamps, routing information showing messages from Fitch's work account to an external address, sent over the same 4-week period as the file accesses. The external address was not in Veridian's contact directory. "I can't retrieve email content without a legal warrant," Daniel said. "But metadata is part of the system logs I had access to. The pattern of transmission timing matches the pattern of the file access queries within a range of 90 minutes, consistently, across 14 instances." Sandra Birch said. 14 instances. Yes. The room was very quiet. Fitch turned to Victoria. He was still controlled. But the control now had the quality of something held together by effort rather than ease. "Victoria, this is a pattern-matching exercise. Correlation is not." "James," Victoria said. Reeves, who had been sitting still with his hands flat on the table, stood up. "Mr. Fitch, I'm going to need you to come with me." Fitch looked at Victoria for a moment. She did not look away. After he left, the room rearranged itself, not literally, but in the way that rooms rearrange when a specific pressure has been removed from them. Sandra Birch said she needed to make calls. Glenn said his team needed direction. Preston said he'd handle the client communications. One by one they moved, purposeful and fast, the clean motion of competent people given a clear line to walk. Daniel closed his laptop. Victoria was still at the table. "The system," she said. "What's the current state?" "Stable. The attacker's credentials are invalidated. I've documented the new architecture for your team." He paused. "Glenn's people can manage it from here. They're good at what they do. They just didn't know what they were looking at." She nodded. She was looking at the closed door where Fitch had left. "How long did you know it was internal?" "I suspected it from the first wave. The access patterns confirmed it." "And you didn't," she stopped. "I tried. The ticket." She said nothing for a moment. He waited. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not a conversation about it. An apology." He looked at her. He nodded. "Once." "All right. That was inadequate. I know it was." He said it without sharpness. "But I didn't stay. To be vindicated. I stayed because the system needed someone to stay. She picked up the cap from her pen and set it down again. What do you want? From this. Whatever comes next. He thought about Chloe at the kitchen table, the drawing, the braids. He thought about the couch and the two-chair kitchen and Margaret bringing her home from aftercare. He thought about what he had spent 2 years becoming and what, over the last 48 hours, he had discovered he still was. I want to work remotely 2 days a week, he said. I want my hours to be real hours, not what the floor expects. I want a scope that matches what I can actually do. He paused. And I want a title that means what the work means. She looked at him for a long moment. Director of Security Architecture. That's acceptable. For the first time that she could remember in the context of a professional conversation, she almost laughed. It came and went in a fraction of a second, a brightness across her face that surprised her with its speed. All right, she said. Director of Security Architecture. The notification that went to all staff the following Monday said simply that Viridian had experienced and successfully contained a cybersecurity incident, that full system integrity had been restored, and that the company was cooperating with federal authorities in an ongoing investigation. It said that Daniel Mercer had been appointed Director of Security Architecture effective immediately. The building registered this, the way buildings register things in corridors, in elevators, in the particular quality of attention that attended his path through the floor. Trevor Shields stopped by his desk on Monday afternoon. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, and said, I should have listened. Yes, Daniel said. I'm sorry. He looked at Trevor, the round face, the earnest discomfort of a man trying to do better than his instincts. You'll listen next time, Daniel said. It was not forgiveness exactly, or not only forgiveness. It was an assessment, and it was accurate. Glenn Okafor came by on Tuesday. He didn't apologize. Instead, he sat down and asked Daniel to walk him through the honeypot architecture, because he wanted to understand it. They spent an hour at the whiteboard. When they were done, Glenn said, I'm going to have my team run exercises against this kind of signature monthly. Daniel said that was exactly right. They did not become friends, but they became something more useful than that. On Wednesday, Chloe came to the office. It wasn't planned. Daniel had a conflict with aftercare scheduling, and Margaret was unavailable, and the circumstances assembled themselves, the way circumstances do, into a Wednesday afternoon, in which he had no option but to bring her. He set her up at the small conference table in his new office. He had an office now, actual walls, a door, a nameplate that someone from facilities had installed between Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday morning with a speed that suggested either efficiency or a specific instruction from the 35th floor with her homework, and a juice box he'd bought from the vending machine on 32. She sat cross-legged on the chair and did long division with the focused severity of a child who took mathematics seriously and did not appreciate that the process required more steps than seemed strictly necessary. She had her inhaler in the outer pocket of her backpack, where he could see it. He had checked twice. At some point in the late afternoon, Victoria passed the glass partition and stopped, looked at the small figure at the conference table, the backpack on the floor, the juice box, the worksheet covered in methodical pencil work, looked at Daniel, who was at his desk with 3 monitors active and a headset on, in a low-voiced conversation with one of Glenn's engineers about the new authentication framework. He was not performing the work. He was just doing it, in the particular way that people who have been doing a thing for a long time do it without announcing, without looking around to see who was watching. She did not knock or come in. She stood there for 3 or 4 seconds, which was longer than she typically stood anywhere. She moved on. But at 5:30, when the building had thinned and the light had gone blue and flat in the windows, the quality of winter light that empties a room of its daytime character and makes the objects in it look like themselves, just objects, just chairs and monitors, and the geometry of a working day in its aftermath. She was in the lobby when Daniel and Chloe came off the elevator. Chloe was telling him something about the long division with an emphatic gesture that suggested a specific and deeply felt grievance with the mathematical system, possibly with its inventor. He was listening with a precision of attention that Victoria had seen him apply to network logs, which was to say, completely. They went out through the revolving door. She watched through the lobby glass as they emerged onto 6th Avenue, the man in the gray fleece jacket and the girl in the winter coat, the backpack bouncing, the white vapor of their breath in the cold air folding into the ambient cold of the street. He took her hand as they reached the crosswalk. She led him without interrupting whatever point she was still making. They crossed, and the street absorbed them, and the city went on doing what the city does, indifferent to the individual, and somehow sustaining every one of them simultaneously, the way a very large system can, when it works. Victoria stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. She had spent 17 years building things, companies, reputations, habits of judgment that she trusted because she had refined them carefully, and they had mostly not failed her. She had also spent, somewhere inside those 17 years, enough time being certain of what she saw that she had stopped checking the gap between what she saw and what was there. She did not deliver this to herself as a verdict. She delivered it as a note, the kind you write in the margin of something you intend to return to. The revolving door swung again. People came and went. She turned and walked back toward the elevator. She had work to do, there always was, and that had never felt like a burden. And it did not feel like one now. But the work was slightly different in its texture from what it had been a week ago. She could not have articulated the difference precisely. She did not try. Outside, the first snow of December was falling again, the same sideways snow off the Hudson, the same gray erasure that had covered the city the morning all of this began. In the morning it would cover everything, and the city would wake to a brief, clean quiet before it recovered itself. The school gates would open, the turnstiles would spin, the monitors would light up, and the logs would run, and the necessary work would go on, most of it invisible, most of it performed by people whose names nobody thought to remember, until the moment when the system they had been holding together quietly, without ceremony, without recognition, finally showed them what it had always needed. Somewhere on the Upper West Side, a man was making dinner in a two-chair kitchen. His daughter was at the table doing the long division she hadn't finished at the office, still aggrieved, the pencil moving with determination. He asked her once if she wanted help. She said no with the completeness of someone who intended to solve the problem herself, on her own terms, in her own time. He did not push it. He went back to the stove. Later, she coughed a little the cold air, the pressure drop that came with new snow descending on the city, and he paused at the sound, ladle in hand, listening, then heard it steady itself, the small respiratory system doing what it did, managing, sufficient. He went back to the stove. The inhaler was on the nightstand. He knew where everything was. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.